Life is a quest for logic and reason. It is a quest to find balance between science and faith. Life is a quest for knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it's a quest for personal discovery. Whatever your quest, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Welcome to Quest. Hi, Matt. Welcome to the Quest podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So I'm excited to have you on the show today. I'm glad you could make the time for me. I'm a big fan. And just to kind of, I don't know how I could encapsulate everything in a proper introduction for you, but I will just kind of paraphrase. You're a legend in the entertainment industry. You're a storyteller. You're an author. You have a new book coming out called Glimpses, a comedy writer's take on life, love, and all that spiritual stuff. You also host a podcast called Glimpses that I'm a big fan of. So welcome.
Thank you so much.
There is so much I want to talk to you about today in your life. But I want to time jump a little bit on it. So
Okay.
I want to kind of like go back to little Matt. You and I have something in common. We both grew up as Indiana Hoosiers. What town did you
I
grow up
had
in?
no idea, Todd, you're a Hoosier.
I am. I'm a Hoosier.
Oh, well, that explains why you're such a nice guy.
I appreciate that. Were you in Evansville? Is that where you were?
I grew up in Evansville, Indiana, the very southern tip of the state, right across the Ohio River from Kentucky.
Yeah.
A blue-collar town. Back when, in the 50s, when I was born, early 50s, 51, as a matter of fact, it was a booming industrial town. And it was a great place to grow up. And then we moved out of the city out into the country on 5 acres. And I kind of lived a Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn life. We had horses, we had sheep, we had guinea pigs. We would go fishing in the creek. We would saddle our horses and ride around the neighborhood. So
Wow.
it was a wonderful place to grow up.
I grew up in Jeffersonville, which
Oh my
is
gosh.
right across from Louisville, Kentucky. It's
You're
the very
right there across from Louisville.
It's
Yeah.
literally exit 0 on I-65. That's the exit for Jeffersonville, is exit 0. And we're literally the very last town. So I grew up in a little town there in the Louisville metropolitan area. So we actually weren't too far apart from each
No,
other.
it's very close. So you're like an hour and 20 minutes apart.
Yeah, for
by
sure.
car.
So it's always interesting to talk to people from the Midwest, particularly people in the entertainment industry. Some of my oldest friendships in entertainment were from people that were from the Midwest. Like it's so much easier, I think, to connect to them.
Well, it was. And, not by design. I didn't consciously do this, but my two partners at Wind Dancer, when I formed my production company, David McFadden grew up in Illinois. Carmen Finestra grew up in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
So you had three Midwesterners running a company. And that sensibility, it sounds like a cliche, but it's true. People from the Midwest show up, do the work, and don't make a big fuss about it usually. And they just get the work done and go home. And I really appreciate that.
You posted some videos recently on your Instagram, I think back during the holidays, where you were kind of at your old home and like showing people like the streets you grew up on and things like that. That was around Christmas, right? Did you post
Yeah,
that?
it was. I went back to the University of Evansville where I got my undergraduate degree and did a book reading of Glimpses, the book that's coming out. And while I was there, I had a videographer with me and I said, guys, let's go visit where I grew up, because it really was a blue collar, working class family, modest. I remember when I was very, very young, I remember my father, who worked in a factory, started making $100 a week. Now, this was in the 50s, keep in mind. And I ran through the neighborhood and I told everyone in the neighborhood, we're rich. My father makes $100 a week. And my dad kind of pulled me aside and he goes, don't say anything.
Yeah.
Just, you don't have to tell people that.
For sure. I want to know, because I think this factors into the rest of our interview. Did you grow up spiritual or religious?
Yes. Oh, from the beginning, I went to Sunday school. I was raised in the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. So that's a very strict Germanic, Lutheran upbringing. I went through 8 years of parochial grade school. So I did all 8 years in Lutheran schools. I went, studied the catechism. I was confirmed in the 8th grade. it was inculcated into me. And no matter how raucous or wild we were, my mother corralled us and shoved us in the old Rambler station wagon and made sure we went to Sunday school and church every Sunday. So that was just my upbringing. And I loved it. It's been the foundation of my life. But then, of course, as you get into high school and college and you start reading and studying world religions, then my view of God, spirituality, the supreme creator, whatever you want to call it,
Sure.
started changing. So I thought, wait a minute, maybe God isn't that old guy with a white beard and a thunderbolt on a cloud. What if
Right.
God is something ineffable and beyond space and time? And so I started studying other world religions. I'm by no means an authority, but I have insatiable curiosity to learn about creativity, spirituality, God, the God source, the source without a source.
Same here. Only difference is growing up Catholic.
Well, there's not that much difference.
Not much,
except
no.
I was taught as a Lutheran that all Catholics were going to hell because that really wasn't a true religion. And I'm sure Catholics taught others that everyone else was going to hell because that's the only true religion, which is the problem with organized religion, right?
Yeah, right.
We subsume, and it gets so myopic, and we get so defensive, and we think in dualistic terms. Us, them, right, wrong, God, devil. No. Come on. God is beyond measure, beyond comprehension. God's a mystery. If we understood God, God would stop being God.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. How old were you when you left Indiana? You did your college in Indiana. When did
I
you
went
leave
to
the
high
state?
school there. I went to the University of Evansville, got a BFA in acting, and then I got a scholarship to the University of New Orleans and went to the University of New Orleans and got an MFA in directing and was part of an acting company there. And so that was the perfect transition coming from a small blue collar town and then going to New Orleans. If I had gone from undergraduate school to New York or LA, I would have drowned. But that transitional period of being in graduate school built up my confidence. I really got a sense of my craft, and I thought, okay, I'm ready to go to New York. So after New Orleans, after I got my MFA, I moved to New York in autumn of 1976.
You know, I think it's interesting. So you kind of had the entertainment was in you already. You were already thinking about that when you were young because your college is, is all around it. I assume you wanted to be an actor.
No, I didn't. I
No?
actually, when I started undergraduate school, I was an English major and a PE minor.
Wow.
And
Okay.
what I assumed I was going to do was be an English teacher and a football coach because I went to undergraduate school on a football scholarship. Now, talk about the hand of God. I got 4 years of undergraduate school paid for in full, having a football scholarship. I got a full scholarship to go to New Orleans and had 2.5 years to get a graduate degree. I didn't spend one penny. It was all scholarships.
Wow.
And I go, man, that must be the hand of God. But no, I started out wanting to be an English teacher and a football coach. And then about a semester into college, I went, I'm kind of digging this theater thing. I think I might pursue it. So that's when I really got hooked and switched to a BFA.
I see. What was your New York life like when you made it there? Had to
Oh,
be a
it's a
huge.
chapter in the book.
We can
Uh,
save it for the book. We can let everyone read the book to read that, but
oh yeah, but I will just shorthand it. I went there knowing no one, being in no unions,
mhm.
having no affiliations, no connections, and literally starved that first year. I mean, I went around, I couldn't get arrested. It was so, and so I won't go into the details because it is a major part of the book. And the essay is entitled Rich Man. And it's where I finally sat down with a yellow pad, because when I pray, I usually have a yellow pad and
Mhm.
kind of write my prayers and think my prayers and feel and I was praying and I basically said, God, I'm a mess. I have nothing. I am broken. I don't know why I moved here. Was this a big mistake? And spirit voice, that true voice that never lies, that lives inside you, that tells you the truth, said, I will prosper you in ways you can't even imagine. And it was an epiphany. It was like being smacked on the, I went, whoa, what? And again, in prayer, I said, what are you saying? And I listened to that voice and said, I will prosper you in ways you can't even imagine. And I trusted that voice and I hung in there. And then from there, the book kind of, by the way, the book has three strands. One is my career,
Hmm.
moving to New York and then creating #1 shows and going to Hollywood. My family, the family I grew up in Evansville, and the family I created with my wife, and my spiritual journey from being that kid in Lutheran grade schools to who I am today as a 70-plus-year-old man.
I love it. I love it. So you got to New York when it was like the seedy New York of the Saturday Night
Oh
Fever
my
movie
gosh,
and the Fame movie, like the nasty Times Square.
it was nasty. This is the God's truth. You didn't leave a party or go home without mug money. Before you
Yeah,
left the party, people said, do you have $20? Because you had to have mug money in case you
yeah,
were mugged so you wouldn't get shot or stabbed.
yeah.
Times Square was what we used to remember as Times Square. It was pimps and whores and peep shows and drug addicts.
Hmm.
And again, I can't tell you how many times walking home after my teleconferencing job, which was my day job that was actually at nighttime, where I served as a moderator on teleconferences. And at midnight, I'd be walking home and all the hookers would be lined up and going, hey, you want to date me? You stepping out tonight? I go, no, I'm from Indiana. I don't step out.
That's funny. That's funny. Let's go to the other coast. Let's go to
Okay.
the big Hollywood breaks. So you have a lot of credits. We won't run them all. We don't have enough time in this interview to do them all. But was the Cosby Show really your big break as a writer on that, or was did your big break come before that?
No, it did. Fortunately, I started, so this sounds weird, but I started supporting myself as an actor so I could teach myself how to write so I would have something to direct. That's really what I wanted. But just because of who I am and where I was born and my physical appearance, I did a lot of commercials. I acted in a great many commercials, and that afforded me the money to live in New York and pursue my real career, which was directing and writing. So I started writing a number of plays. Those plays got into the hands of the Cosby producers, and they called me in for an interview because I guess this was even before the show premiered, Todd.
Hmm.
It was the Tuesday, in fact, before the show premiered, they called me in and they said, we read your one-act plays. They're really funny. Do you think you can write TV? And I said, I have no idea. They said, are you funny? And I said, not necessarily. I said, but I have honed my craft. I know how to tell a story. I know how to write plays. And if the characters are funny, then the scripts turn out funny. Well, they asked me, said, watch the show Thursday night, come back on Friday. And I watched the show. I had the audacity to go back and give them notes on the pilot of The Cosby Show. They wanted my opinion. And I said, well, and I gave them, so they hired me. And I
Mhm.
think it was the shortest contract you could possibly have in the business, which was something like 6 or 8 weeks. And that was my big break. So the very first TV show I wrote on becomes this phenomenal hit.
Oh yeah,
And
huge.
again, the hand of God. And I learned my craft. I learned TV on that show.
Did Roseanne come next?
No, actually a different world.
Oh, yeah, right. Different World was the
Carmen
spinoff, right?
Finestra, John Marcus,
Right.
and I wrote the pilot of A Different World. We were
Hmm.
still doing the Cosby Show, but as a sidebar, we with Bill, I think Bill gets the creative by credit. We get a development credit. It doesn't matter. Bill wanted this idea of creating a show in a university, and so we wrote the pilot. So A Different World was next, and then my last season, which was my third season on the Cosby Show. I was working part-time as a consultant writing scripts for Cosby while developing and writing the Roseanne pilot. And
Gotcha.
Roseanne, the pilot of Roseanne, is what got me out to LA.
I see. And then Home Improvement was after Roseanne.
Yeah, I did Roseanne, launched Roseanne, then I signed a deal with Disney, an overall deal with Disney. I created a show called Carol and Company with Carol Burnett,
Hmm.
which lasted about a season and a half. It was a successful show, but it was a tough show because it was an anthology. And in the second season of Carol and Company, we met Tim and started developing, and we took a year to develop Home Improvement. Home Improvement, and that was the next big show.
Was always curious on the order of those things. You know, when you mention a different world, was a different world being developed kind of on its own anyways, or was it? I always thought it was developed because they wanted to kind of get Lisa Bonet out of the Cosby Show. Was
Well, Bill, and I'm talking about Bill Cosby, the genius and the man, not the other Bill Cosby
right?
that has gotten all the press.
Sure.
Bill was an advocate for education. His
Hmm.
whole drive in life was education changes people's lives. He really wanted to show what college life was like for African Americans, and
Gotcha.
then bringing a white character into that world, so you have a fish out of water to kind of process and see the world through their eyes. And he was emphatic that we need to show college life, what it's like, who these characters are. And what's interesting to me, Todd, I teach at Columbia. I'm an adjunct there, and I teach television pilot writing. I can't tell you how many BIPOC writers say that show had a major influence in my life, because
Mm,
I got to see my people on screen in a college situation. It inspired me to go to college.
yeah.
And so it's fascinating that a different world, which was kind of the spinoff, and you knew you were going to put it behind Cosby, and you kind of knew it was going to be successful. I'm surprised all these years later how much impact that show has had on people's lives.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Obviously that was like the heyday of my watching TV. You know, all these shows. This is why I'm a big fan of you, is you did so much stuff that was important to me. Um, and I have a couple of questions about, so I don't want to, go back in time too much. And a
Okay.
lot of this, anyone under 40 listening to my podcast, I really have to school them on what these shows were. Because it's
Well, you thank God there's reruns, there's residuals, there's streaming services, there's
I know. I want to know, you were a creator and the writer of Home Improvement, and I want to hear about that experience from you, what your life was like then, because I imagine that's when things really blew up for you, and you were
they
incredibly
did.
famous at that point. What was your life
Yeah,
like then?
absolutely. This is a big part of Glimpses, because my wife and I got married, got pregnant within the first month or two with our daughter Matisse, who I believe was the first guest on your show.
This season, yeah,
Yeah, this season.
yeah.
Anyway, so I was developing the pilot for Roseanne, and I thought I had, 8 months to a year. And I handed in the pilot, and Tom and Marcy called and said, ABC wants to make it. You have to be out here in February. Well, my wife was 7 months pregnant. We had just bought a house. We had just set up the baby's room.
Oh,
And I had to say to my wife, honey, there's good news. They want the pilot. And she goes, great, but we have to leave for Los Angeles in about 2 weeks. So I plopped my very pregnant wife in a rented house that was furnished, and then went and worked 20 hours a day, 7 days a week,
wow.
launching the series. But that was Roseanne. And then after that was Home Improvement. And then our second child was born the same time we were launching Home Improvement. So somehow babies and birthing pilots was kind of happening at the same time. But yes, after Home Improvement, everything took off. And then I really built the production company with David and Carmen, and we started developing movies, making films, and we even had a playwriting wing where we were commissioning plays. So we went from 3 people to 32 people and a production company up and running.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, Tim made the show Last Man Standing recently, and to me, it looked like almost a mirror image of Home Improvement. Was there ever talk about rebooting Home Improvement or a continuation of the original show? Because that seems to be the trend these days of like rebooting stuff.
There was a lot of talk about rebooting it, and but I think for matters I can't discuss, legal and contractual matters,
Sure.
it never materialized
Mm,
with Disney, because Disney owns the show.
yeah,
Now, Home Improvement did end up on Disney Plus.
yeah.
So those folks under 40 can turn on Disney Plus if they want to see what we're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Do you mind talking about the Roseanne show a bit?
Well, I will. I'm not going to go into gossip. I'm not going to disparage her. It was a very tough. You know, it's like Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times.
Hmm.
Creatively, it was the best of times. It was a show that was drawing on my childhood, my blue collar upbringing.
Yeah.
And the the original concept was three women who worked in a factory. One was married with kids, one was divorced with a kid, and one was single. Tom and Marcy then introduced me to Roseanne and said, this woman has a voice. She's got a feminist voice. She's funny. We think she should be the married woman, okay, in your series. Now, here's the problem. When I say it's the best of times, the worst of times, there's almost a minefield that's being created, which is, Matt, we have found an actress for your show. And they say to the actress, hey, we found a writer for your show. I don't know what was actually said.
Right.
So there is an adversarial dynamic that is set up from the inception. So I will say this, the show that I wanted to create would have been a lot more sentimental and soft. What Roseanne really brought, her personal experience, her feminist point of view, her edge, that edge is what made the show work. So, I'm forever grateful. It was a rough experience because at some point, who controls the show? Who has the final say? Well, it's usually the showrunner. But then once a show hits number one, it can be the star.
Yeah.
And so it was a very rough period, but one I wouldn't change because look, the show's still living in the Connors and it just continues to live.
I read some trivia that the original title of the show was Life and Stuff. Is that right?
Life and Stuff. I wanted to name the series Life and Stuff.
And it was going to be more of like an ensemble of people.
Yeah, and more of an ensemble.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly, that was the idea. But I will say this, and this is not Hollywood myth, this is truth. When we went about casting the husband in the series, for Roseanne, we were looking for a husband. I saw this guest spot on a show called Moonlighting with Bruce Willis and Sybil Shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
And I called Tom and Marcy and I said, I saw Roseanne's husband. He was a guest star. It was a reverse on the Cinderella story. I think in that Moonlighting episode, he lost his shoe or something. But I said, and Karen Mandelbach, the producer of with Tom and Marcy, said, no, I found the actor. He's down in La Jolla doing Shakespeare. Lo and behold, we're both talking about the same actor, John Goodman.
John Goodman, yeah.
And when John Goodman walked into the room and laid eyes on Roseanne, I don't remember the exact words, but he said something like, shut up and move over. She said, you be quiet. And they started bantering. And it was instant chemistry. And Tom and Marcy, after the quote reading audition, said, there's your series. You cannot capture that kind of chemistry. They just had, it was a perfect dynamic. So you see how the focus of the show shifted to the Connors, that became the core relationship, Dan and Roseanne.
Yeah. And I think really the two things I wanted to get out of, chatting about the Roseanne show a little bit was, I was always under the impression, and I was very much right out of high school when these shows were on, and so I'm coming at it from the consumer aspect of this that watches the shows. I just assumed, I never knew that was supposed to originally kind of be an ensemble and it had a different name. I thought that all these comedians, there's that old joke about there's a producer standing out in front of the Comedy Store giving out TV shows to people because, Ray Romano and Seinfeld and Tim Allen and Roseanne Barr. I think Brett Butler was a stand-up comedian that had a show for a while. And like everyone in that day was like a stand-up comedian getting a show. So I always assumed this was just built for Roseanne.
Well, it was certainly conformed to her,
Mm-hmm.
but the impetus, the original idea came from my blue collar background, which was I talked to these women who worked in factories and I interviewed hundreds of them. And I said, if you have $5 extra, what do you spend it on? If you lose your babysitter, what do you do? I found that these women had a support group where they supported each other. So that was grounded in my background. But yes, I want to address the stand-up phenomenon. Look where it really started. Back up a few years. Mr. Bill Cosby.
Right. For sure.
He took his stand-up routine, right? And they, not me, they took a stand-up routine and created a pilot. That set a trend through the whole 80s and in the early 90s where you have a comedian. Now here, Todd, here's the catch-22.
Mhm.
If I'm building a series around Todd Fischer, the stand-up comedian, if I capture it perfectly and capture your voice and people that world with other characters, then Todd can say, well, look, you just ripped off my stand-up. If I don't capture your voice perfectly, you go, look, you can't write me. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And I
Right.
can't tell you for all the stand-up comedians that got series, how many failed.
Mhm.
And believe me, I met a lot of these comedians during that period, but it takes more than a stand-up. You have to have a point of view, a worldview about what the series is about. You
Right.
have to orchestrate characters who will challenge and augment that worldview. You have to really have a thematic premise that's going to drive 200 episodes.
Yeah.
So it's more than just, most people think a funny person telling a bunch of jokes sitting on a couch. That's not a sitcom.
Right.
That's a bad sitcom.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of thought. Like I said, we took a year to really talk to Tim and talk about masculinity, to talk about the male-female dynamic, talk about all that before we even wrote one word of the pilot.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I wonder, the stress you went through on the Roseanne show, how did that affect you? Because I imagine there's already sort of that Hollywood rat race thing that always happens. Were you getting broken down at all in Hollywood? I always find that a lot of people that start spiritual and religious, it sort of beats it out of you when you're in entertainment too long. Did you ever take hits like that?
It did just the opposite.
Really? It strengthened you.
It did just the
Mhm.
opposite. It strengthened my spiritual belief and realized that this is all transitory. And there's a lot of bullshit about being number one and having your photo in the LA Times or, being in the trades. What it grounded that, my spiritual beliefs, and having two young children at home and a wife. I always knew I worked very hard. And as soon as I got off work, I went home to my wife and kids.
Mhm.
You know, I never got caught up, if you will, in the patina and perception of Hollywood and aren't we God's gifts to creation? I always knew it's like being a construction worker. You show up, you do your work really well, you pack up your tools, you go home to your family. That's how I approached Hollywood. And I just knew, I mean, I was fascinated. Again, God's hand to two number one shows and creating movies and all this stuff. It was great, but I knew that ultimately wasn't who I was in my core.
Yeah.
That was something I do. That's what I do. That's not who I am. Who I am is that kid that grew up in Indiana and
Mhm.
sitting in the church pew in St. Paul's Lutheran Church. That's who
Sure.
I am.
Well, it's funny to me because I've known your name in entertainment for a long time. And but I never, this was all pre-social media, right? Like, so the only information you really got about people was maybe something you'd see in Dramalog magazine or Hollywood Reporter or Variety, or, the more entertainment weeklies and those more consumer-oriented magazines. And even then, you weren't seeing the behind the scenes people that much, but you kind of knew who show creators were, just didn't know
Right.
them. And I didn't know what to expect with you. So I had always, heard your name around, but I didn't know you could have been a narcissist, an egomaniac. What a lot of people that had big shows were like that. But you did your Glimpses podcast, and it gave me a glimpse into who you were. And I was like, wow, this guy is not at all what I thought he was going to be like. And I love
Thank
that.
God.
I love that you did that, and you kind of opened yourself up to the public, because 9 out of 10 people I meet that are Hollywood people are, fairly toxic and awful people. And I'm
Well,
glad
I
you're not
think
like
what
that.
happens is and believe me, I suffered from mogullitis. That's what I call it.
Mm-hmm.
That when Wind Dancer grew and all of a sudden you've got a second number one show and you're developing movies and everyone's throwing money at you and everyone's coming. And I lost my center for a while. And I just started growing faster, bigger, more, faster, bigger, more, without going, what's the intent behind this? I truly believe this is on my webpage. I talk about it in the book, Love, Create, Serve. I really believe We are here to love first God, then ourselves, then our family, then our extended family and the world. Love, create, whatever you create, whether it's skyscrapers or you bake cookies or you create television sets, create, and then serve. How are you serving others? How is what you have created serving others?
Yeah.
And I think what happened for a while in Hollywood, and I write about this in the book a little bit, is I lost sight of the intent behind the creating. And it was just competing. If I've got 2 shows, 3 shows in the top, 4 shows in the top 10, I need 5 shows in the top 10. That movie was #1. We need another #1 movie. And all of a sudden you get what I call the hamster wheel of Hollywood. And it's just running faster, 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 more, bigger, better, more, bigger, better. And at one point, my wife turned to me and she said, "You have never been so busy in your life, and you've never been so unhappy." I think something's got to change. And you talk about an epiphany. It was like, you're right. I fell into that trap of competing with and comparing myself to other producers, other production companies. So I was just creating for the sake of having another credit, another show in it. And I had to reel that way back and shrink the company. And then finally, as I approached my 65th year, I went, you know what? I think I'm out here running in this hamster wheel just to prove to people that I still have some juice. I'm going to close up shop. And that's when I closed up Wind Dancer and moved back to New York, took a deep breath. And then I went, wait a minute. And I talk about this. What happens to a storyteller, a writer, when they die? What happens to the untold stories that still live inside them? Do those stories die with the writer? Do they float up to the ether? Do they float up there in some kind of spiritual cloud and other writers snag a word, a character, a phrase, and then start writing? And I turned to my wife and I said, I don't want to die with all these stories still living inside me. And she, who's the smartest person on earth, said, well, then do something about it. So I pulled out the yellow pad and I started doodling. And next thing I know, I went, oh, these stories are flowing out. Oh, this might be a book. And that's how it evolved. That's how Glimpses evolved.
I see. I want to know, what do you think about this? Why do you think public figures keep their spirituality and their religious affiliations hidden? Should public figures maybe be more open about sharing that? And, the idea of hiding it, does that imply some kind of shame?
I think it's a defense mechanism, really, because regardless of your religion, organized religions are often the problem. Spirituality isn't competing and comparing.
Sure.
There's a creative spirit, I believe, that animates and drives, permeates, animates, drives, and expands the whole universe. I believe we are all connected by spirit. I believe every living thing in the universe, when the Big Bang occurred, when that little explosion happened, all the matter that exists right now existed in that one explosive moment, and we are a part of that. And matter, energy cannot be created or destroyed. Energy, all it does is keep transforming. So if we are all part of the Big Bang and we're all connected spiritually, why do we set up these little cubby holes of, I'm a Southern Baptist, so you're wrong. I'm a Lutheran. I'm a Catholic. I'm Muslim. I have Islamic. I'm Buddha. Blah, blah, blah. And I go, wait a minute. This is all self-imposed, and it's so counterproductive and so naive. Spirit transcends all. It's just a matter of how you tap into it. One of my favorite authors is Matthew Fox, and he's got a brilliant book called One River, Many Wells. And the concept is based on Meister Eckhart's concept of a river flowing spirit. We're all trying to tap into the same spiritual source. We just dig different wells to tap into that river.
Right.
So whether you have a rosary or a prayer bead, or you're at a wailing wall, or you're dancing a sun dance and you're channeling Wankantanka, however you access it, the great mystery, the holy mystery, the divine creator, We are all part of that. So what drives me crazy, and to go back to your original question, is if I went around Hollywood and told people I am a Christian, as soon as you hear that word, that's a red flag for a lot of people. That means intolerant, misogynistic,
Hmm.
right? Right wing, Bible thumping, judgmental.
Right.
You're all going to burn in hell if you don't believe like me.
Right.
Well, I am not that. I am a follower of Christ.
Yeah.
There's a big difference in my mind.
Right.
The simple teachings of the historic Jesus are so simple. And anything that is wonderful and grand and enduring is usually simple. And when you shrink everything down to what is the great and first commandment, love the Lord thy God with all your heart, soul, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two depend all the laws and the prophets. That's the whole shebang, folks. Love God, love others. It's all done. So I think if we walk around and go, well, I go to this synagogue, I go to this church, I go here, it sets up a competitive us-them relationship. So why can't we just agree we all have different ways of approaching the divine? We have different ways of worshiping. We have different ways of expressing God's presence here on earth. Let's just accept that and do it however you want to do it. I'm not here to bang you over the head and convince you of anything or convert you. I'm here to share the joyful, wonderful, creative experience I've had with spirit throughout the years. I want to share that with you.
Yeah.
That's what the book's ultimately about.
That's beautiful.
And it's called Glimpses because it encourages the reader, regardless of their religious background, their culture, age, whatever, to look for and find little glimpses of God in your daily life.
Yeah.
But it takes an effort. You have to look around because, listen, the world's pretty tumultuous right now. But if you look around, there's little moments of grace and goodness and tenderness. There's little flickering fireflies of hope out there. We've got to look for those fireflies instead of wallowing in the darkness.
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
going to get off my pedestal now. I'm on my soapbox. I'm going to step off it, Todd.
Well, this is a great segue because the podcast was what I was going to talk about next. And you say this in that podcast all the time. So tell the listeners a little bit more about what you do on your Glimpses podcast.
Well, Glimpses was the name of the book. And then when I thought about, I got off social media completely. When I was never on social media. I'm old, right? But when I left Hollywood, I didn't want any social media presence. I didn't want to do, I just want to be left alone in my library to write.
Right.
Well, then you go out with a book and the first thing they ask is, well, where's your social media presence? Where are you on social media? And I go, oh, crap. You mean I've got to do this? And then I kind of resisted, but then when the podcast came around, I went, wait a minute, I enjoy this because I'm curious about humans and human behavior and what they believe and how they think and what's their greatest fear and what's their greatest joy. So the podcasts have been a joyful experience. And Glimpses is more than a book. It's kind of a movement where I really do, through the podcast, through social media, through any lectures I give, book signings, I really want to open hearts. I want people to laugh. I want to open their hearts with this book. And with the podcast, I want to take, I guess, the scales away from our eyes and say, look at the world with a little fresh perspective, not your algorithms appear on your phone, the news that we hear every day. We are told constantly, we're all a piece of crap, we're all doomed, the world's ending, it's terrible.
Yeah.
Well, if all of us process that and hear that daily, our unconscious mind goes, you're right. The unconscious mind doesn't judge. It accepts what you tell it, right? So we're all telling ourselves, this is the end of the world. We're all going to die. Well, shouldn't we shift gears and say, wait a minute, there is hope. Let's embrace, and I'm not talking about world peace overnight. I'm talking about just common human decency in a grocery store line. I'm talking about not yelling at someone at a stop sign when they don't move. Just small moments of grace and goodness and tenderness and being open to spirit. And by spirit, I mean that loving, creative presence that lives in all of us. It gets so buried. It gets so buried.
For sure. So the book was first. I didn't know which came first, the
The
podcast or the
book.
book. But yeah, the book was, well, you were
The
developing that,
book
and
was
then the
first,
podcast
and the
spun off.
podcast was a way of promoting the book and getting the word out. Because as I don't know if you've mentioned this already, but the book, all the profits from the book will go to charities that help children in need around the world.
Gotcha.
I have
Yeah.
4 specific charities that I'm giving all the profits to.
Mhm.
So I'm emphatic about, I'm like a shoe salesman. I want to sell this book. I want to sell a lot of books. I want to make a lot of money so I can give it all away. That's my
Yeah,
goal.
for
It's
sure.
that simple.
Um, will will the podcast continue for a while? I mean, I
Yes.
think everyone likes it. Like, we're gonna have more, right?
Yes. We've got some banked and in the pipeline. I'm taking a little hiatus now
Mhm.
to do the launch of the book, which is February 13th. So I'll be in New
Yeah,
York doing some book readings and signings. So I put the podcast on hiatus for about 6, 8 weeks
sure.
to really go out and promote and push the book.
Yeah.
But come spring, I've got another 20, 30 guests I want to have on the podcast because I really enjoy. The one thing about being a writer is what drives you is your curiosity about human beings and human behavior, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's nothing on earth more fascinating than human behavior. So
Yeah.
I get to sit across from these creatives. I think my next guest that's coming up is Stephen Adley Gerges, who's won every award, one of the most brilliant playwrights we have in America.
Mhm.
And to be able to just riff with Stephen was a joy with all these people. So
Yeah.
uh, I, I I find that the podcasts stimulate me, they excite me, and they give me energy. They don't drain my energy.
For sure. I feel the same way. I'm so inspired by people. When I started my Quest podcast, the first season of it was really a companion to a book that I put out. I was very similar way in which I did mine. And what it was I had to cut so much stuff out of my first book. I wanted to I wanted to put it back out there into the world. So I had people come on and talk about the book, the parts that I had to cut out. So it kind of became the unabridged version of my book in a way, the first season of the podcast. And then after that, it just became I wanted to interview people that were exceptional, that would inspire me, that were outside of the work that I would do. And that's what it's been ever since, is hearing other people's stories of how they persevered or got where they were or what they did. And
You just said the operative thing for me. Hearing other people's stories. Stories are so important because stories, it's on my webpage, but I believe this in my heart.
mhm,
Stories connect us.
yeah, for
And
sure.
as soon as I tell you a story or you tell me a story, we are connected on a deep level, more so than just an intellectual level. I've shared my story with you, you've shared your story with me. It's what stories remind readers and listeners that what it means to be human, what it means to be alive at this moment in time in history, what
Hmm.
it means to be part of a global community, what it means to love and to suffer great loss and survive and thrive. Everything that happens to us as human beings is embodied in stories. And once I read your story, I have a little part of Todd in me now. I will carry a little part of Todd in me for the
Yeah.
rest of my life once I've heard your story.
Yeah.
And that's why reading, I know we don't read anymore. We watch, we scroll through Instagram, but reading or even experiencing really good television or films open up something in us that's higher
Yeah.
and bigger and better in us.
Certainly. And, I think that people's influence on others is sort of an immortality in that way. It could be a 5-minute conversation at a gas pump that you just don't forget, and I love that. And speaking of entertainment, one of the things I want to say is sometimes I get people that criticize me for bringing someone from the entertainment industry on my podcast. But I want to say this, and I think this is very important. Entertainment is a good and decent public service. And the reason why I say that is because I also grew up in a blue collar home. My dad worked at the post office, and what really kept him sane, I think, all these years was he had this schedule. He came home from the post office, he read the newspaper, his wife had dinner cooked for him, and then he watched his favorite shows. And it was always a cop show. In the 70s, it was Hill Street Blues. In the 80s, it was Miami Vice. In the 90s, it was NYPD Blue. It was like And it was like he had this thing, and then he watched the sports, and then he went to sleep, and he woke up and he did it again. And he did it every day, all the time. And I don't know if the world without books, without TV, film, theater, if people would just go crazy. You got to have something to unwind with. You got to put on your favorite album for an hour, and sink yourself into that music, have that Taylor Swift experience or whatever. You got to, watch a Rambo movie so you can just like unwind and, watch explosions and things like that. And people still consume this entertainment. And I think in a way, it helps them survive the day to day because a lot of people have the same problems. They have student loans, they've got mortgages on their homes, they've got insurance, they've got all these bills. They live paycheck to paycheck. They might get 2 weeks of vacation a year. Everyone, most of the country, they go to the same places. They go to Gatlinburg. How many times in Indiana did you hear people say, we're going to go to Gatlinburg or Myrtle Beach? Of all the beaches you could pick, why did you pick Myrtle Beach? And it's like, it's the same thing at Disney World. That's where you go. That's just where people go. And then they go back to their day job again, and they're sort of in that matrix system. Does that make sense? And I feel like the entertainment in all its forms is vital to people just to want to.
I know it's vital because anytime you tell stories, whether it's a half-hour sitcom, a 2-hour movie, a miniseries, a streaming service, or you're reading a book, it's transformative.
Mm-hmm.
And by transformative, I mean when Todd sits down at the beginning of an episode, by the end of the episode, Todd should be slightly different
Mm-hmm.
as a human being. Something in Todd changed. And I said this with Tim, I think during the podcast I had with Tim Allen, when people used to go, oh, it's only a sitcom. Yes, there's a lot of dumb sitcoms out there, no question. But I go, think about this. And I'll use Home Improvement as an example. When you have a sitcom and millions and millions and millions of people across the country are watching it at the same time
Mm-hmm.
and laughing, those endorphins are released, the laughter connects. They are connected on some level through the laughter and the storytelling.
Yeah.
And you are transformative. A good theater, when you go see a play or a musical and you sit down at the end of the evening, you are a different person for having sat there in the dark and watched these characters live out their lives in front of you. That's the power of story.
Yeah.
And it teaches us what it means to be human. It teaches, and it goes beyond religion. I think it's a shared ethos.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shared ethos.
Yeah. And also things like sitcoms, you can't really laugh and worry at the same time. So it's a great reliever of some of your pain to be able to live in that moment for 22 minutes with people you see and you like. We're running out of time, but I do want to ask you one question as a writer. Watching some of my favorite shows from the past today on streaming services where I can watch them one after another, where in the past really wasn't, you had to catch them in reruns and things of that nature.
Right.
A lot of shows still hold up. I like to watch Cheers. I still feel welcome in that bar. I still like everyone. But I feel like some shows didn't age well. And you watch these shows and you go, man, these people are really unlikable when you watch them one after another and you don't have a week
Right.
to decompress from people. Is it more difficult today to be a writer for streaming services where everything drops at once than it was in the old days? Or do you think it matters?
No, I think the difference is, like you said, appointment TV when I was coming up, you could only see Cosby Show on Thursday night in that time slot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even Home Improvement and Roseanne. Now you can binge watch. But I think what you're talking about is relatability. I remember years ago, we were in a rehearsal. It was my second or third week on the Cosby Show as a baby writer. And I was watching a scene between Rudy and Theo. They were
Mm-hmm.
rehearsing. And someone in passing said, if you were at home right now watching this family, wouldn't you want to be a part of it? And I thought, yes,
Mm-hmm.
that's the key. So and I use in the book Cheers as an example. You always want to pull up a stool and sit there at the bar with these characters. Friends, you want to hang out on that couch with these people, right?
Yeah,
You
right.
look at Seinfeld, you want to wait for Kramer to come bouncing into that apartment. So yes, I think if it's authentic human behavior, you take what's truthful and exaggerate it to create comedy. If you do that, then that comedy is relatable 20 years from now, 30 years from now. If
Right.
you're writing goofy characters doing goofy things and not really coming from a human, truthful, authentic place, those things don't last. They don't have legs, those
Sure.
shows.
Yeah.
That's just silliness. But true human behavior, and take what's truthful and exaggerate it. But really, and with TV especially, you invite the audience to come right in and pull up a chair at the Roseanne's table. Sit on
For
the couch
sure.
with Tim and Jill.
For sure. And I think there's some real genius. I know a lot of people don't like the last episode of Seinfeld, but I think there's some real genius in that episode, because when they go back in time and they sort of tell the story in court about all the awful things these people did, you really realize they were all awful people. And I just felt like this hilarious, because when you do binge watch that show, you really realize how awful each one of them are individually, the terrible things that they've done. And they really, watching it week to week, you didn't get it. But then the final episode really schools you on these people were all terrible.
I think what, they used to say that it's a show about nothing, right? It's a show about nothing. And no, it's about obsessive, self-involved people.
Yeah.
And that's what they're shining the spotlight on. Aren't we all silly? Look how obsessed and self-involved we are.
For sure. So where's the podcast is available on Spotify? Where else can people get it?
YouTube, Spotify. But if you go on my website, mattwilliams.com, they'll find links to that. And the same thing with the book. The book can be pre-ordered now through Simon & Schuster, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. All those links are available, and pre-orders are important, obviously, before a book is published. And the release date, the actual publishing date, is February 13th.
Yeah.
But we are really promoting and trying to get the pre-orders right now.
Will that be an audiobook as well?
Yes, I've recorded it. I still have to do a few pickups, and the audiobook, I don't know when that will be released, but there's definitely an audiobook, and for better or worse, I'm reading it. So
And people can find you on social media too. What's your handle on social media?
Matt Allen Williams.
Matt Allen
Williams. Hashtag Matt Allen Williams.
Great. Matt, thanks so much for coming out today and talking. Just really an amazing conversation. I'm gonna try and see you in New York if you do a book signing there or reading. I want to come see it, introduce myself in person. And I hope you come back again.
I will gladly do that, Todd, and I wish you well with this.
We'll talk soon. Take care.
All right.
Metacortex Publishing hopes that you've enjoyed this presentation.
Please take a moment to listen to some other podcast offerings from Metacortex Publishing.
Hi everybody, I'm Amber Rose, the religious hippie, and I host the podcast A Catholic's Perspective. Join me every 2 weeks as I release episodes targeted towards helping young Catholics navigate their ever-changing secular world while staying strong in their faith. Whether you are a Catholic or not, all are welcome here. So if this is something that interests you, feel free to tune in. You can find A Catholic's Perspective on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I hope to see you there. Bye!
Hi, I'm Father Daniel Duplantis, a Catholic priest, martial artist, and host of the Karate Priest podcast. Have you ever wondered what the church teaches about different topics? Are you a martial arts enthusiast or just someone who wants to learn more about martial arts? I'd like to invite you to join me and many guests on my podcast as we cover topics of faith, everyday living, and martial arts on the Karate Priest podcast.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fischer and Anthony Smith and is distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for Metacortex Publishing at metacortexpublishing.com or find us on social media for other unique content.